12 actually.
Oh, from Monday? Really? Okay.
We're hoping. कल DOE में decide हो गया था, and they were going to take it to disaster management today. But I don't know why schools kind of have gone through this open close thing, but universities have largely just stayed closed, right?
Actually, Delhi University is very peculiar, so we have a lot of students who are outstation students.
Got it. Got it.
So, they're all staying, many of them are staying in hostels, PG. So, unless, and I don't really think unless they kind of make it compulsory or, just close the online thing, how, even in schools, that's what's happening. No? So, even if they open schools, as long as they give the option, people don't really, uh, so unless they close down online teaching. And we are in very complex this thing. So, we have 3 semesters running at, 3 different intervals.
Okay.
So, there's some of the
Got
teachers
it.
who haven't really
Are you
got
running
any.
odd semesters right now, or have you gotten to even? Is
So
abhi
two, yeah. So there is one odd, which is first semester, and then there are 2 even, which is fourth and sixth.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
So
we had Delhi Skills University launch this year, DSU.
yeah,
So haven't even seen the students, honestly.
yeah. So my present first and second years, they haven't seen college at all.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's hope before at least the third year have seen it for a semester. I know maybe you can ask them how Okay, so Lupali is saying we are live now. Okay, so Seema, anyways, we thought we'll live stream it on the
Sounds good.
college YouTube because then it kind of stays there and people keep coming back to it.
Sounds good. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me know when it gets started.
Yeah, so I think what time it is? It's 4:03. So maybe by 4:05 we can start.
Sounds good. Let's do that.
Kushag.
Yes, ma'am. We'll start by 4:05.
This is mostly which year? Are you guys all first year, second year, third year, all across?
All across, ma'am.
Okay.
Ma'am, you are on mute.
Sorry. Yeah. So these are mostly from my college, Khalsa College. There'll be
Acha.
few outsiders also because it's gone out to everybody, and then there are my colleagues as well. Few of us are here. We're broadly economics honors, Khalsa College. Over to you, Kushag.
So we'll be beginning now. A very good afternoon to one and all present in this meeting. I take extreme pleasure in welcoming you to today's candid conversation with Ms Seema Bansal on the intersection of management consulting and the development sector. She is a partner and director at Boston Consulting Group, India, and an IIM Calcutta alumna. This candid conversation is a part of a larger series organized by EcoTrust, the Economic Society of Sri Guru Tegh Bahadur Khalsa College. All of us have heard the saying, not all heroes wear capes, and the same can be said for our guest of honor, Ms. Seema, for she has been tirelessly working on improving the condition of public education in India since 2013. She has worked and continues to work on several education, literacy, and health programs with the central and state governments. She has given several TED Talks speaking about her work, especially with the states of Haryana, Jharkhand, and Rajasthan, which you can find on YouTube. As per the BCG's website on social impact, MAM's team is working with more than 2 lakh schools and 20 million children in India. Currently, she has been heading the Social Impact Division at BCG for the Asia Pacific region, a post for which she has the expertise and gravitas. Before we begin, I would like to request you all to keep your mics on mute unless asked otherwise and turn on your cameras so that we have a great interaction and not a mundane session. Our principal sir was not able to join us today, but he extends his kindest wishes and gratitude to all of us. In order to maintain the flow of the session and have a meaningful conversation, it would be easier to take up the questions in such a manner that before understanding the role of a social impact leader, we first understand the role of a consultant and then move on to the social side of it and how ma'am decided to pursue the fields of public education and health. In order to kick off the conversation, our first question to you is: if you had one word to sum up your experience as a consultant, what would it be and why?
Thank you, Kushagat. That was very well spoken. I think you gave me more credit than I deserve, and thank you, Dipali, for inviting me. Genuinely a pleasure to be here. I love interacting with young people. I love understanding where people's aspirations are going and how things are moving. So just absolutely a pleasure to be here. One word to describe 20 years in consulting. I think the word that I genuinely really like when I describe consulting on campuses is the word audacious. The audacity. I'm assuming all of you sort of understand the word audacious or the word audacity, right? And from the very beginning of joining BCG to even today, I always wonder how organizations give us the mandate, give us projects which are just truly audacious in the way they are, and for how young consulting teams tend to be. So my very first project in BCG 21, 22 almost years ago was at that point of time there were two banks, Standard Chartered Bank and Grindlays Bank, and Standard Chartered Bank had bought Grindlays Bank in 15 countries. And there was a team of 10 or 12 people from BCG whose job it was to help with the integration of the two banks. And I, along with a consultant I was 23 and my consultant was like 25, we had the responsibility of helping the retail banking divisions of Standard Chartered India and Grindlays India come together. And I was like, how is that even possible, right? Like, how is someone trusting me with something that crazy? And I think most recently, Kushaga, the project that you talked about, where we're working with the three states, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, and Odisha, and Rajasthan also, put together, they have more than 2 lakh schools and 2 crore children in them. So working with those states to try and help the state governments improve the quality of education, it's just another example of a very audacious project. So I think I genuinely feel extremely privileged to have been able to do this for the last 21 years, to work on crazy projects, to work on audacious projects, and hopefully move some things in some places a little bit. So I don't know if you guys had a format for today, that's great. What I was hoping to do was maybe just take 20 minutes, because we have an hour and a half, an hour, 20 minutes now. So maybe take 20 minutes to just present a little bit, set the context in terms of, just introducing myself a little bit, introducing what consulting is, what social impact consulting is, what does it look like in India more broadly, what are the kind of projects that BCG does, to kind of just give each one of us a frame to talk through, if that's okay. Is that okay with you?
Yes, ma'am, please go ahead.
Yeah, and then we can still keep like 45-50 minutes for free flow conversation, but I think a lot of your very basic questions might hopefully get answered by some of the things that I have to talk about. Yeah?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I'm going to try and share some slides. Okay, can you all see this?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. So very quickly, just an introduction to myself. So I lead the social impact practice at BCG in India, and I also mentor, I would say, the practice in other parts of Asia. What that basically means is that I do a lot of work with governments, and I'll talk in a lot more detail about that. I do a lot of work with governments, do a lot of work with development organizations, NGOs, multilateral, bilaterals like World Bank, ADB, UN organizations like World Food Program, etc. And we also do a lot of work with foundations and CSR strategies, right? So foundations will be philanthropic organizations which are different from maybe NGOs and multilaterals, bilaterals. So it's a fairly broad body of work that we have at BCG, and like I said, it's a privilege to lead it. More personally, I have 2 kids. That's a picture of them from many years ago, but I have a 12-year-old daughter. I have a 10-year-old son. It's been an adventure to try and bring them up. Amazing kids, and I love being a mother to them. And I'm also very much just an outdoors person. So if I am not at work or with my kids, then I'm probably doing, either I'm on a trek or maybe, diving, or if it's in Delhi, then cycling. So just wanted to sort of introduce myself more broadly than just outside of my work. Live very much here in Gurgaon and have been living in Gurgaon for the last 13-14 years. I joined BCG 22 almost years ago in 2000, straight from campus. When I joined BCG, I thought that I was joining, consulting for 2 years. I hadn't worked in between my undergrad and my MBA, so it felt like a good thing to do to try and join consulting, learn about various sectors and industries, and possibly move out 2 years later. So I genuinely believed that I would leave consulting in 2 years. Did not ever expect to be almost a lifer in consulting. It's been an interesting journey. For the first 7 years, I had almost nothing to do with the social sector or with the impact sector. I did work across sectors: financial services, telecom. I have worked in paints, I have worked in cement, I have worked in pharma, lots of different sectors, lots of crazy experiences. Have spent months in rural MP, at a cement plant and all sorts of things. Did a project on telecom in Indonesia as well. And it was much later, when I was much closer to, actually I was just turning 30, that I felt that I wanted to, experience something different, do something different. I just wanted to try the development sector. I did not know that I wanted to make a career here, but I wanted to try it. And BCG gave me the opportunity to do so. And lots of ups and downs in building out a practice. But I decided to stick with it. And I know many people here will ask me a lot of questions later about how do they get into social impact consulting and some of those things. But I genuinely want to say that I think people who straddle corporate consulting, or forget consulting, corporate life, commercial corporate life, or work outside the development sector, actually probably make better development sector professionals. Development sector is still fairly unorganized, chaotic, and has a lot of people who have deep passion, but I do believe it doesn't have enough management capability and expertise. And I think people who go and work in other places and then come to the development sector, or do a mix of both, probably make for better sort of contributors to the development sector than people who don't. So just some early advice in this talk. This is the social impact practice. It really grew from nothing. In 2012, there was literally just one person that you see the team size, one principal, that was me. To today, I think we have a fairly large practice. We have nearly 60 people working in social impact at BCG. We're working across 7 states, very large range of organizations. The practice is so large that I cannot even sort of put my arms around it. And I felt quite proud to be a part of it. Felt quite proud to have sort of set it up. But we're also just constantly cognizant of the fact that when we do these projects, that's a huge responsibility. It's almost a moral responsibility that we have when we undertake some of these projects, and it's really important for us to do well in them. So that's just the nature of practice, and I will talk about some of the projects a little bit more deeply in a few minutes. Yeah. what I wanted to do was just talk about social impact consulting landscape. So what comes in social impact? Obviously, different people define it differently, but at BCG and typically in most consulting firms, social impact has about 5-6 topics. So there's global health, so anything related to public health, primary health care, in SDGs, we hear things like neonatal mortality, infant mortality, and more recently, we've also been talking about, communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases, etc., etc. All of that public health work, where the government comes together to provide healthcare to the broader public, is one part, right? That's global health, because that's a very critical part to creating a population and a demography which is equal and which is prospering. The second part of it is education, end to end, starting from early childhood education, school education, higher education, skilling, and so on and so forth, and more recently related to that, employment. So education and employment is the second topic. Global development is an interesting combination of topics. It includes everything to do with, I think, income and livelihoods. So it includes financial inclusion, it includes creating jobs, it includes agriculture and increasing income from agriculture, and many of those topics, right? So that's the third. More recently, climate and environment and everything related to that, hence water, oceans, air, is also a very large part of social impact, right? So these are the 4 topics that I think everyone kind of knows of. Of course, now we're also starting to talk about things like, diversity and inclusion. Typically, the way, some of these things were defined was that each of these have some cross-cutting themes, like gender is a cross-cutting theme across all of these. But now diversity and inclusion is something which is getting added as a specific topic. We haven't fully added it as a separate topic to our topic map, but it exists. And more recently, I think there are a couple of more topics which are getting added. And this is where the corporate sector interacts with social impact. So typically when people think about social impact, they think governments, foundations, NGOs. But I think increasingly, and you all are studying economics, increasingly there is a narrative around how the private sector itself is responsible for social impact as well, right? And typically, how has the private sector been measured? They have been measured on something called total shareholder return. How much money do you return to the shareholders? What return do you give to them? And there's a global conversation, typically starts sort of in the Nordics and kind of moves to Western Europe, North America, and then slowly comes to Asia. But there's a global movement around, corporates need to measure themselves not only on shareholder return, but societal impact. Yeah. So the right measure to measure a corporate and its success is not just shareholder return, but societal impact. Societal impact includes shareholder return, but it also includes things like, what is your impact on climate? What is your impact on water? What is your impact on wealth aggregation? What is your impact on global waste? What is your impact on employment? All of those things. So the philosophy is that a company should constantly be thinking about its returns, not only to its shareholders but to society. And then also there's a huge piece of work for those of who you understand, those of you who understand sort of the investing markets, private equity, debt, capital, loans. How is money being invested, and is it being invested towards sustainable businesses or businesses which are not necessarily sustainable or have the most ethical practices with respect to societal impact? So trying to make sure that capital goes towards those businesses which are more responsible than not, right? So what is happening typically to social impact practices across consulting firms is that there were typical topics of education, health, environment, agriculture, etc. And now we're increasingly starting to talk about the role of private sector in social impact and these topics. Only 2-3 more slides, I promise. this is basically, you don't have to read the full slide, but just look at the columns, So there are 3 types of consulting firms which work in social impact. There is the big 4, like KPMG, PwC, Deloitte, EY. They do a lot of work. They do a lot of work with governments. They also do a lot of work with multilaterals, bilaterals like World Bank, ADB, USAID. Typically lower price points than us are able to put together very large multi-year teams. And there's a lot of work there. There's a very large range of social impact consulting firms, so Dalberg, Bridgespan, which is an offshoot of Bain, FSG, and a number of Indian firms like Sattva, Samagra, Samhita, IP Global. So very interesting. All of them have different models. Bridgespan does a lot of work around, corporate philanthropy or individual philanthropy. Dalberg does a lot of consulting work for international foundations. Samhita does a lot of work on CSR strategy, so on and so forth. Samagra does a lot of work on grassroots transformation and campaign-based change, community-based change. And then there's the bigger consulting firms, McKinsey, Bain, and ourselves. And I think for the most part, the bigger consulting firms don't really have a social impact practice, except for BCG in India. All of them have a climate practice. So all of them do a lot of work in climate, but typical topics of social impact don't exist in them. Long-winded reason for that, I think social impact projects come at a very different price point. BCG has found a way to make it happen. So all of our internal projects are subsidized. They're not loss-making. We cover all of our costs and earn some profits, but they're at a very different price than, let's say, if we were to sell a project to Pepsi or Tata Steel or so on and so forth, right? Whereas I think the other consulting firms haven't been able to do that, so haven't grown that. So that's just the landscape of social impact consulting in India. And I'm going to take maybe 2, 3, 4 minutes to talk about a few cases, examples, and then, we can just chat. So this is the one I kind of talked about. This is the, 2 lakh schools, 22 crore children. So just as context, I don't know how many people know this, but India has about 15 lakh schools, 1 lakh, 15 lakh, 10 lakh government schools, and about 3 to 4 lakh private schools of various shapes and sizes, including every small private school in every village, right? We were invited by Niti Aayog about 4.5 years ago to help 3 states drastically improve the quality of public education. So now the really interesting thing is that India as a country is one of the countries where the percentage of children who go to public schools is the lowest in the world, Many of us probably never went to a public school or never even have seen a public school, government school from inside. Most of us go to private schools. As a comparison, in the US, 90% plus kids go to public schools. China, 100% of the kids go to public schools. Most countries, the number is 80% plus. India, the number is about 50%. So only the bottom 50% of India's kids, where there is no public school close by, or where there is where they don't have money to pay the very basic fees of the lowest cost private school, is where people go to public schools, and which is just a sheer waste. We have 10 lakh schools, and no one wants to go to them unless they actually have to, right? So, and if you think about the budgets which are spent on them, etc. So we work with the 3 states of Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, and Odisha. To help understand why public schools, why government schools do so poorly, and what can be done to improve them. I can do a full lecture at some point in time about school education. I won't, but there are many myths around why education systems are so bad. I think there are some myths around, teachers don't get paid well. Primary school teachers in Jharkhand get paid anywhere from 60 to 70,000 rupees per month. These are teachers who teach grades 1 to 5, are asked to work 6 to 7 hours a day for 200 days a year, right? There's summer vacation, winter break. So it is actually a myth for the most part that, government teachers don't actually get paid well. I think there's varieties, and it's also a myth that people just don't want to work. We have met enough and more, teachers, principals who actually genuinely want to provide high quality education. One of the biggest reasons, and I talk about this quite a bit, is that we have too many schools in India. Yeah? So I talked about the fact that we have 10 lakh government schools in India. If I was to ask how many schools are there all put together in China, the number is 2.5 lakhs. So China has 1/4, actually 1/6 the number of schools than in India. For about the same school going population, because China has lesser kids, but we also have a lot of dropouts. And China's land area is more than 3 times that of India, right? So for the same number of kids and 3 times more land area, China has 1/6 the number of schools. So part of the reason why India has such poor quality education is that we have way too many schools. You go to a village and there will be 5 schools. Each school will have 30 kids, 1 teacher, 2 teacher trying to teach multiple classes. So one of the biggest things that we as BCG advocate for, and we're not very popular for, and I'm certainly not very popular for, is actually school consolidation, shutting down schools, consolidating them into bigger schools to actually make them better schools, so on and so forth. So when we work with state governments, we try and do some really bold things which can improve school education. Most of the time they're not possible. In Jharkhand, we helped, close 5,000 schools. There were protests across the state. There were media articles. BCG was, badmouth in the press. The ruling government was badmouth in the press. It's very difficult. So those are the kinds of things we try and do when we try and work inside a system. Here's another example of a very different project. This is with Rockefeller Foundation. Did this about 4 years ago. Rockefeller Foundation is a foundation based out of the US. They do a lot of work in energy access. So their basic premise, and again, as economists, you'd probably agree with this, is that provision of energy, provision of electricity, especially in rural areas, because in urban areas it mostly exists, provision of reliable electricity for more number of hours in a day leads to overall economic development of a community. There is more economic generation activity. There is more electricity at home for things like studying, for varieties of things, right? So they actually have enough data from across the world to say that if there is energy access to a community, the community itself will prosper in many different ways, including, for example, gender empowerment, etc. So they work in India to make sure that villages actually have energy access. They had been working in India for the last 6-7 years. Their model was very different. Their model was to take away the role of the government and to set up private mini grids in villages, which would supply power. But that business wasn't working. And what they asked us to come in and say, why is this not working? And what we realized was that the business didn't make sense. So they had taken a certain cost economics of the business, which actually didn't pan out. And the cost of electricity was too high. Because the cost of electricity was too high, people were not buying electricity, and the whole model wasn't working. So we kind of then suggested a very different model where they don't not work with the government, but partner with the government, leverage government resources, to make this happen. So that's a very different project. The first project I talked about, it has been running for 4.5 years, and we're just handing it over to the government. And this project was literally like a 4-month project where we went in, looked at something, and did a strategy piece. This is not me, but my colleagues who do health. We have over the last 2 years, done a lot of work with Ministry of Health and Family Welfare on COVID-19. COVID-19 sort of data diagnostics, data analytics, vaccination strategies. How do you actually look at data from across the country and say, where is vaccination high, where is vaccination low, what is happening, what is not happening? How do you think about vaccine supply chains? How do you engage private sector in, in the whole vaccination piece, et cetera, and hopefully some of that has, helped make some things happen. Of course, all of it was done by the government, but we did play a very small part in it. And finally, another example is that Google was wanting to look at, digital education and how, especially in light of COVID and schools being shut, and how does Google think about its education products like Google for Education and others to take digital education to the masses, to government schools, to universities, etc. And we help them, do something around that. I'm going to pause there. That's just some examples. Okay. Can you guys see me again? Is the screen share off? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, cool. So I just wanted to maybe share a little bit of that. I think introduce myself, talk about what we do at BCG, talk a little bit about social sector consulting, what it looks like, who are the players, and what is the nature of projects. Hopefully that kind of gives everyone a, some frame and so just some very basic understanding of what this whole thing is about. And that's what I wanted to present. Now I'm really just happy to take this, Kushagra, you and as others see fit. I'm very happy to answer questions if there's a set of, like, whichever way you guys want.
So basically, ma'am, we floated a form for which, like, for you, like, where we could get the questions. So I'll like ask some of the most commonly asked questions, if
Sounds
that's
good.
okay.
Maybe what you can do is maybe, give me 2-3 questions sort of together so that I have a sense of what is there and I can, rather than going one by one. Does that work?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
That's how we planned it as well.
Okay, great.
So the first question that we got was, how would you describe the role of a consultant, like in the general sense and in the social impact sense as well? And what exactly is the basic process that is followed from the time the company receives a case till the time the case is closed? Like, what are the basic steps involved and everything? And apart from that, what are the integral skills that one must hone to have a career in consulting?
Got it. Okay, so what is the role of a consultant? How does a project look from beginning to end, and what are the skill sets? I think there's different types of projects. Like I mentioned, there are projects which can be 6 weeks or 3 months, like the Google project or the Rockefeller project, and there are projects which can be, especially in the social sector, as long as 3 years or 5 years. Yeah, and the role of a consultant is probably 2, 3, 4 things. I think consultants are firstly over glamorized in every way possible. Many times we have people come in and sort of say, I didn't realize I will have to move a file from office to office all day in a government office, right? So most people think that consultants do very glamorous strategic thinking and we solve big problems, and we do that, but there's a lot which happens behind that also, and in addition to that also. Yeah. So I think a typical small project, a 2-month project or a 3-month project, there our role is very much to be an outsider who is looking into an organization, being able to diagnose a problem using their prior knowledge, and not their own individual prior knowledge, but the firm's knowledge, right? And using a set of problem solving skills to come up with an answer which the organization may have found hard to come up with because that organization is too deeply involved, right? And is just too deep in what they do day to day. So I think the Rockefeller project is a very good example of that, right? So very smart set of people in the organization. There are folks sitting in New York, there's a full team in India, they've been running this business. Why do they bring external consultants to help them reflect on their own organization and what's working and what's not working, right? One is to say that, look, we are too deep into what we do every day and we're probably not able to look at it rationally. And when someone looks at an organization from the outside, they're probably going to be able to look at it a little bit more rationally, dispassionately, right? That's one part of it. Secondly, as consultants, we probably have done work like this in many other places, in many other projects, which we can actually leverage and use, right? So that's the second part of what we kind of do as consultants. So that is a typical role in what we call a strategy project. Be an outsider, but bring in topical knowledge and bring in very quick problem solving skills. At the end of the day, when we did the Rockefeller work, honestly, I had almost never worked in the power sector before, right? And I was like, how is it possible that we're going to walk into a company which works in the power sector and be able to do something? But I think sometimes even who take their times off and some of those things. Kushal, you also asked about the no questions asked leave of absence. Is that what you asked?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, any consulting firm of reasonable size is about 600-700 consultants, right? Team members right now. So if at any point of time 20 of them take time off because they want to take a leave of absence, and it means that if they're allowed to take the time off, they're likely to come back happier, more energized, and probably stay in the firm for another year. I think the ROI on that is very, very high. So I mean, like, I think 10-15 years ago, it was almost unheard of. Everyone was like, consulting used to feel like campus races, right? Like, first kaun aayega, sabse pehle kaun promote hoga. Now I think consulting internally has very much become about, I want to live life at my own pace. I will get promoted at my own pace. So at any point of time, we have at least 5 to 10% of the staff who's on various types of flex models, who's on LOAs, who's part-time, who's doing an internal role, who's studying abroad for a short period of time, who are seconding into another organization, etc., etc. So all of those are very much possible, which I don't think typical corporates necessarily are able to manage for.
Okay, ma'am. And apart from this, ma'am, you also define traveling as a major part of consulting, and like how you need to be ready to leave on a Monday morning and be ready to get back home on Thursday or Friday or even Saturday for that matter. So, can you tell us how you coped with traveling at the start of your consulting career versus now?
I think start is exciting. Like, I mean, yeah, anyway, probably, I mean, I was living in a paying guest, like, who wants to live in a paying guest in Bombay? Like, you'd rather, live in a fancy hotel in Delhi or whatever. So, I think, what I sort of noticed when you're young and or some of those things, the idea of actually traveling 4 to 5 days a week is pretty cool because, you're well taken care of. You are with a team probably where you are. It's actually a lot of fun. The teams always hang out, in the evenings, etc., etc. I've not necessarily seen a lot of young people actually complain about traveling. In fact, most people enjoy traveling. On weekends, you can choose not to come back to your base location. You can stay back where you are. You can go to another place. You can see the country. When people get staffed on international projects, I think they see the entire region. So if you're, staffed in Singapore, most people will see all of Southeast Asia across every weekend. So that's not an issue. I think oftentimes traveling becomes an issue for people, when they get married or potentially, when they have kids or when they have someone else to take care of at home, etc., etc. I do think, some of it is manageable. So consulting firms, for the most part, are quite large, right? And I personally, for example, over a period of time, chose to do financial services and telecom before I moved into social impact consulting because those clients were always either in Bombay or in Delhi. Yeah. So I did a cement case where I spent 2 months in rural Madhya Pradesh, and I was like, this is not something that I can do over a period of time because, if you are going to be doing steel or cement, then you are going to be in, rural Odisha or Jamshedpur at best or XYZ, right? But if you're working in the banking sector, if you're working in telecom, if you're working in IT, you're most likely going to be in Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, right? And even within that, over a period of time, can you find ways to find local clients? Yeah. So I think as people get more senior, they do manage to steer their career in ways which make sense for them. And it's almost, I would say that find a sustainable career is because they didn't actively think about it. No one forces you to pick a particular career path in consulting. No one says कि तुमको इंडस्ट्रियल गुड्स ही करना है या तुमको जाके टाटा स्टील के साथ ही जमशेदपुर में काम करना है. You make these choices, right? And you make these choices happen over a period of time. Even if you're stuck on a project that you don't want to do, which is not in a location that you want to do, over a period of next project or the project after that, you can find a way to work in the city that you're in. So I do find that as people get more senior, they find work where they want to be, or people who are choosing to travel are people who are genuinely want to do work that is outside of their city, are passionate about that client or that sector or that space, and it works for them. So I don't think travel, to be honest, travel tends to be a little bit hard in the middle years. Initial few years, you typically enjoy it, and later you find a way to manage travel. It's in the middle years when you probably still have, family commitments, a significant other, and so on and so forth, and you still haven't found your space or your vibe in terms of where you want to be. But that's typically a 2, 3, 4-year thing and not longer. After that, honestly, there's a lot of flexibility to choose and create the career that you want to.
As
I
we
mean,
all,
I can't say that in the last 7 years anyone has forced me to travel. Right? I have chosen to do a case in Jharkhand because I wanted to do that case. Right? And I am doing projects in Delhi right now because I want to do projects in Delhi. No one's told me to do it.
okay,
Sorry, go
ma'am.
ahead.
Yeah, ma'am, as we all know, like COVID like drastically impacted the traveling policies and everything. So how difficult was it to go cope with the COVID-19 policies or work around the restrictions? And did it drastically increase the timeline for the completion of a case?
There's a lot of questions around work-life balance. No, I think on the whole, I would say COVID, at least from my point of view, has probably been very positive for the consulting industry because we've all learned how to be effective without traveling. So I remember making a chart once and I just like tabulated all of my travel through the year. And I remember thinking that I did about 50, 60 nights away from home for non-client work. So this was recruiting events on campuses, IIM Calcutta mein jaake PPT dena hai, IIM Ahmedabad mein interviews karna hai or XYZ. We used to have a lot of global conferences, just internal BCG global conferences, social impact practices meeting in Paris or education practices meeting in Singapore or XYZ is happening in US. I used to do like crazy 2-day, 3-day trips to Europe, and we've learned how to do all of that far more effectively sitting at home or sitting in office, right? So I don't think campus recruiting will ever go back to visiting a campus 6 times in a year. We might visit for the final interviews, but I do think that a lot of the interactions that we had in terms of talks and events, etc., will probably move to sort of meeting platforms. Similarly, what we're finding is that our global meetings are far more effective when we don't make people travel overnight on red-eye flights and they are jet lagged, and they're far more effective when you kind of just can get together on a Zoom platform. Yeah. So I do think overall, consulting travel will reduce drastically. We joke that as BCG, we announced our net zero policy in 2019 that BCG is somehow going to move to net zero, and consulting firms have a very high carbon footprint just because of the sheer travel, right? Everyone's on a flight every third day, and we had announced it, but I think we were very nervous about how will we achieve it, like how are we going to just cut down on our travel. And I think then COVID happened, we're like, oh wow, I think we can actually achieve our net zero ambition. So we joke about that. So I think long term, consulting will probably become far more sustainable because of COVID-19. I think many things, there'll be new ways of working. Within, I think overall, it has been hard. I do find it very difficult to sit in front of a screen, from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. and just engage with clients only and teams. So thankfully, I work in the government sector, and except for 4 months over the last 2 years, governments have been open, right? So I have I think there's only been 5 or 6 months in the last 2 years that I've fully worked from home. Otherwise, there's always been like step out for a meeting, go out for the day, etc. I've even traveled, so, but it was quite intense to just sit in front of a, computer screen all day. Boundaries blurred in terms of, what is at least at when you go to office, when you come home, you're not working when you're at home. There are people who've honestly joined and quit BCG without ever seeing a human soul from the firm, right? Because they were at BCG for 18 months and they never really saw anyone. So it's been hard, and I do think that many times client engagement is far more effective when you're in person. I talked about how BCG is a very people-based business, and I think being able to interact physically is very important part of it. So I'm glad that things are opening up and we're sort of going back to our meetings and etc. But I do think overall consulting will be far more sustainable because of COVID-19.
Okay, I would now like to open the floor. For questions from the attendees. The attendees can either send in their questions through the chat box or just send a hands up so that I can call out their names and they can unmute themselves and ask the questions. Sarthak Paul has asked, what growth opportunities and exit routes or branches are there in this field?
Okay, and do you mean consulting or social impact consulting?
So Sarthak, I guess it's consulting as a whole only.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I think the growth opportunities within consulting, there's a typical consulting path. So you start as a senior associate consultant, project manager, and when you become a partner in the firm fairly quickly within 10 to 12 years, if you don't take too many breaks. But there's also, I think now increasingly across consulting firms, there are ways to specialize. So earlier we just only had the generalist track. Now we have far more possibilities in terms of specialization. So for example, we have a very large data analytics team, we have a geoanalytics team, we have a consumer research team, we have a knowledge and research team. We have, teams which specialize in behavioral sciences and leadership enablement. So we have consulting as a business has moved from being a business of only generalists to a core group of generalists who have a lot of specialists available to them, right? So there are a lot of opportunities around becoming a specialist within a consulting firm or staying on the generalist consultant track. So that is within the firm. Honestly, exits are, very positive. I think 2-3 years in consulting in any firm, doesn't matter whether it's BCG or anyone else, gives you great opportunities outside. I think you kind of skip 2-3 years. A 2-3 year stint in consulting firm will probably be equivalent to 5-6 years of general corporate experience. So kind of exits that you get in private equity, venture capital, or in tech firms, big tech, startups are very high quality. I think exits become hardest when you become reasonably senior, because at that point of time you want to exit probably to run businesses, and to be honest, consultants never run businesses. We only give gyan, right? So very few senior consultants actually leave to become CEOs, to be honest. You might become head of strategy at XYZ company, you might become senior advisor to the CEO, but how many people become CEOs is very hard. But before that, exits are exceptional, very high quality. How much?
Shreya Bamla is asking, ma'am, how much do you owe your career in consulting to an MBA? Would a career background in MBA or economics serve better?
So I think I owe my career in consulting to the MBA to the extent that I don't think I would have been at BCG if I wouldn't have joined BCG or consulting if I didn't go to IIM Calcutta as quickly, or maybe never, right? So I think consulting firms still recruit from very few campuses. There is, I think 70 to 80% of the recruitment is from business schools and about 20% from, undergrads, which continue to remain a very small set of undergrads. I don't think it's about, having a particular degree or not having a particular degree. We have doctors, we have people who were in the services, especially in other countries, but even in India, we have CAs, we have all types. We have commerce specialists, we have, mass comm people, etc. I think there is a certain skill set that an MBA teaches you, which is generally applicable to consulting. You have to understand how a business works, but honestly, that's not rocket science. Many people can actually learn it. We also tried recruiting lawyers once, NLS, for 2 years. That didn't really work very well for us. Typically, lawyers struggle quite a bit with maths and Excel and some of those things. So I think it's really just about, I think, like I said, there's a certain set of skill sets that you have, and MBA is not critical to that. Most people who do an MBA have those skill sets, but anyone can have those skill sets. And it's the same thing with economics. I think between honestly an economics and an MBA, I think an MBA is more aligned to what you do on a day-to-day basis in consulting than pure economics. But we have a lot of people who come in with just an economics degree and do very well.
Shringesh is asking, like, you have been working in consulting for the past 20 plus years. So how does one find out what is exactly right for him or her? And did you actually at one point of time want to leave consulting as a whole?
So I think people joke about how Seema is always ready to quit consulting, but never does, right? So if you ask anyone in BCG, anyone in my family, they'll be like, yeah, if you ask, and even if you ask me today, how long will I be in consulting? I'll be like, not more than 2 years, right? And I've probably been saying that since the day I joined. And I always have a plan for what I want to do 2 years later, but it hasn't happened. So, and then I think the other thing I want to say is that, I mean, I think there's very few things. I mean, there were probably very few people who can sort of say this one thing is the right thing for me. I mean, Dipali can probably, talk to this, but all of our friends, colleagues who are sort of our age have probably done 5 to 7 career shifts in their lives, if not more. And while I seem to have done only one thing, which is stayed at BCG, I think within that I have, at least done 2 very different things. One is, actual true consulting, commercial consulting, and then really just social impact and development sector. And if I was to describe what I have done in the social impact and development sector, every 3 to 4 years, there's been a very significant pivot. So when I first started, I thought, we would work with NGOs and we would help NGOs become better and do better work. Then I said, no, and I did that for 3-4 years. And then I said, no, this is not exciting. NGOs are always, too small and outside the system. Then I worked quite a bit with central government, Niti Aayog, Ministry of, this, that, and the other. More recently, then we started working in states and foundations. And now we're doing a lot of work more with political leaders than any other stakeholder, right? So where there are politicians who are committed to change and who are wanting to do big things. So I feel like every 3 to 4 years, I have had a shift in what I wanted to do. I think the only cool thing in some ways about consulting is that there's many things consulting, because it's such a wide platform, you can make most of those shifts within consulting, right? Someone joked at with me one time. They're like, tell me one thing that you want to do in the world and I will find you a place in BCG where that is happening. So even if you said, I want to work in sports, we've consulted with the city of Chicago for their Olympics bid, and, we've done some work, we've helped in the past people bid for IPL rights, and, we've consulted sort of, XYZ sports academy, whatever, right? We've done sports work, we've done agriculture work, we're doing big data work, we're doing EV work. So I think consulting makes it easy to do shifts. But no matter where you start, when you finish your education, I can assure you that 95% of you will not be doing the same thing, or 90% of you will not be doing the same thing 10 years ago. So it's never the right thing. You will never know what is the right thing. You can only know what is the next right thing, right? That this is what I want to do next. And as long as, you are thinking about that rationally a little bit, as long as you're thinking about that with boldness, you have the courage to take some of those bold steps, but also the intelligence to take the right steps, you will never go wrong. Your career will build from one place to the other. And for the most part, it will build in the right direction. But it will never be 15, 20 years later, there's no chance you will be where you started. Almost no chance. So just go with your gut, talk to a few people, have a few mentors and advisors who can give you, good advice whenever you need. And then take whatever your decision you think is important. And honestly, even if you feel like you're not starting at the right place, life is very long, you will get to the right place. There are many people who say, oh, I really want to be in consulting today. Even if you can't be in consulting today, I assure you, you can find a career path to be in consulting 5 years later. Not to say consulting is an amazing place where everyone should want to come, but even if it doesn't happen today, it will happen 3 years later. You just have to find your path to it. Yeah.
So even Deepali ma'am has came up with some questions. So I'd like to request Deepali ma'am to unmute herself and ask the questions.
No, actually, if you want, you can take students' questions first, because probably, mine are more towards the kind of work you have done. So, or should I go ahead? So basically, Seema, I was just wanting to ask you, since we are all in education and I have students here and you're so deeply involved. So what, in few sentences, what really ails India's school education, if you would have, especially given that, you're trying to, you suggest that we should reduce the number of schools. So, there must be something majorly different from China so, in few thoughts. And then, because, from school they're coming to college and, we are speaking here, all of these are college students. So is there something that is kind of, carried on to the college level?
Yeah.
There's something missing there. And then if you think the new education policy is just few thoughts.
No, sounds good. I'd love to talk about that. I think honestly, school education, like I said, I think there's some fundamental premises on which our public education system got created, which actually, in hindsight, do the system disservice than are beneficial. So one is, I remember a very senior IS officer in Rajasthan describing this in very succinctly. He basically said, when we realized in the 1980s that enrollment ratios in India were very low, only 50, 60, 70% of the kids were going to school, India as a country decided that we must do something about it. Primary enrollment, grade 1 enrollment has to be as close to 100% as possible. Every child should have access to school. But instead of bringing the children to schools, we decided to take the school to the child. So we decided to open up a school. Our policy, national policy, says that there has to be a school within 1 kilometer of every living in habitation. Every child has to have a primary school within 1 kilometer of their house, right? And that is why we have 10 lakh schools, 11 lakh schools, whereas China has 2.5 lakh schools. But at the same time, because India is a resource constrained country, we also said for every 30 kids, you will only get one teacher, right? So if you have 60 kids, you will get two teachers. Now there are about 400,000 schools in India which have less than 60 kids, right? But across grades 1 to 5. So you have 40 kids, let's say 8 kids in grade 1, 8 kids in grade 2, 8 kids in 3, 4, 5, and you only have 2 teachers and 1 midday meal cook. You don't have a principal, you don't have a clerk, you don't have a sweeper, nothing. So those 2 poor teachers in 400,000 schools, 4 lakh schools in the country, have to do everything. They have to teach. Firstly, I don't even know how 2 teachers teach 5 classes. So one teacher sits with classes 1, 2, and 3 at the same time and is trying to somehow teach all of them math at the same time. But you have to teach one of them number line and you have to teach the other one addition. And Dipali and I have kids. I mean, even to try and teach one kid is very difficult, but to try and teach 24 kids, very different things at the same time. And then you have to do everything. You have to manage the scholarships for these kids. You have to manage the school budgets. You have to open the school, lock the school. And it's quite possible that of the 2 teachers, one is sick, then there's only one teacher. And that is a huge problem. That is a very, very large problem. That, coupled with the fact that our government schools start at the age of 6, and our primary school system, which most people don't even know, is called the Anganwadi system, doesn't work at all. Wahan pe the Anganwadi worker in India is typically a 10th or 12th pass lady who has 5 things to do on an everyday basis. She has to do early childhood education. She also has to do vaccination. She has to give nutrition related information to pregnant women in the community. So how much primary education, pre-primary education is she going to do? So we have this whole mass of kids who come into grade 1 without ever having received any pre-primary education. And then you're put into these schools which are very poorly resourced. So you've basically lost most of the kids at that stage itself. And these kids are first generation learners for the most part, even in urban areas. Kids of our maids and drivers are for the most part first or second generation learners and have no academic support at home. So jo school mein hoga wahi hoga, jo ghar pe, there's no support at home. So it is at that level that we're losing most of the kids, right? And that is why I think in the new education policy, there's a very large focus, at least on foundational literacy and numeracy. The idea is that if you lose a child before they're 8 on their learning journey, then they will never be able to make it up. But if you're able to ensure that every child has basic literacy, reading with comprehension, and basic math skill, wo apne aap bhi pad lega, right? Like if you're able to read by yourself with comprehension, if you're able to write, then your dependence on the external system actually reduces, right? So that is honestly one very large, big issue that we have. The second big issue that we have in the education system is, and no one talks about these things, right? People will talk about, oh, teachers nahi aate hain, ye hai, wo hai, right? The second largest issue that we have is that our teacher salaries across the country are mapped to, in schools are mapped to pay commissions. So like I said, the on paper salary in Jharkhand from a primary school teacher is 70,000 rupees. What has that led to? Jharkhand has no money to recruit and pay primary teachers 70,000 rupees. So over the last 10, 12 years, Jharkhand has not, and this is not true about Jharkhand, but about half the country, Jharkhand has not recruited primary school teachers. So पहले ही स्कूल में 2 teachers होने थे, and now there's significant vacancy, or they will recruit contractual teachers at 10-12,000 rupees salary, right? So we have as a country about 30 to 40% teacher vacancy in our schools. 30 to 40% teacher vacancy, and that is because our salary structures are just off, right? And as a country, we don't have that kind of money to pay to teachers. Now, one can argue that teachers should be highly paid. I genuinely agree that teachers should be highly paid and all of that stuff. They're very important. But at the same time, our budgets do not allow for that, right? So unless we're willing to increase our budgets by 2x, our budgets don't allow for that. And the truth is that in private schools, same teachers will work for 1/3 the salary and will deliver far higher outcomes, right? So I think that's the second fundamental challenge that we have. And until we solve these very basic challenges, no matter how much technology you put in, no matter how many books and workbooks you change, no matter, none of those things will actually improve fundamental quality of education because our basic structural systems are actually broken. And then we can get into lots of other things about, quality of, curriculum and pedagogy, teacher training, all of those. But honestly, think that many of those are things which can only improve the system from 10 to go from 10 to structural challenges have to be addressed, which no one talks about. And then the final thing I would say is, I think we have inherited an education system which comes from the British era. So if you think about our board exams, what do we study in CBSE and ICSE in 9th to 12th, right? I mean, I went to a rural school in Odisha, and it was a girls' residential school, tribal girls' residential school, and all of these girls, like beautiful plaits and red ribbons and kurtas and chudidars, and sitting on the floor on a dari, and they're all like looking at some screen because it was some edtech pilot chal raha tha wahan pe. All tan 45 is equal to 1, 9th 10th grade tribal girls in rural Odisha, and I'm like, what does that even mean? Tan 45 is equal to 1. Why are you studying this? Aapko kya karna hai? Aapko kya banna hai? And they're like, they have no clue what they're studying, right? So I think till grade 6, 7, our curriculum is broadly still okay. But I think over a period of time, what are we trying to teach our kids? And is that even relevant to what they want to do? Most of the girls want to become a school teacher back in their village. They want to see XYZ. So what we see is that our not higher education, but our secondary education is outdated, right? It tries to teach exactly the same thing to every child. Has to study trigonometry, study XYZ, has to learn knowledge of why. And most countries in the world have moved to a very different system of secondary education, where depending upon what you want to do, the secondary education that you go through is very different. So if you want to leave school after grade 12 and want to work, you will not be taught trigonometry, but you might be taught very basic, in this day and age, coding, so that you can become a simple software programmer after 12, which you can. And I'm not saying, and typically in India, vocational is defined as electrician bana do, plumber bana do, but not that, right? Schools are actually geared to very different demographics and what they want to do and what they want to learn. So I think that's the other big structural problem of having a secondary education system, which is only probably relevant for 10-15% of the population and is not relevant for 80-90% of our large rural and middle income, low income population. There's lots of other problems with capability, teacher training, B.Ed, school education system, but there are these 3-4, at least I feel, big problems. Higher education, I think, you guys can say more, but again, I think at least we do a lot of work on the skilling side and linkages of education and employment, right? And I do think that we need to fundamentally think about what is the purpose of higher education and what percentage of people need what kind of higher education, right? So we have historically, again, had a lot of generic, BAs, BScs kinds of programs. Our universities are filled with tons of seats around that. And the linkages of that to what the economy needs, where employment is, are fairly limited. And I think going forward, how do we bring the right mix in our higher education of what economy needs, what employability skills are, what real life world skills are, versus like just a very basic grounding in higher education and concept and theory and broadening of your mind. Like, what is that right mix? I think that generally needs to be sort of thought through, right? So on one hand, you have industry complaining ki we don't find talent, and on the other hand, you have people saying we don't find jobs. But people exist on both sides, and demand and supply exists. So I think some of these experiments, like Delhi Skills and Entrepreneurship University, we're launching a bachelor's in banking and financial services, which doesn't exist in the country, right? No one trains you for the banking sector, whereas there are hundreds of thousands of jobs in the banking sector. Who becomes a bank branch manager or a sales executive or a back-end office is like, aapne engineering kar liya, aapne commerce kar liya, and then you're like, acha, let's get this job now. But hey, if you were trained for that job, now today digital design is very big, digital marketing is very big, coding is very big, healthcare as a profession is very, very large. We're not moving our higher education towards that, but a lot of our higher education is sort of very generic. So I think, given that I come from the business side, I know it's a narrow view, but I do think that how does higher education link with one, employment and employability and what the economy needs, but also gives a more generic, real world, holistic set of skills to our students rather than, very theoretical sort of topic knowledge oriented sort of learning. I think is the second thing. Finally, new education, I think it's a beautiful document. I genuinely think NEP is a really beautiful document. I think it's a great document as a vision document. I think what it lacks is any sense of implementation, right? So if you count all of the recommendations in NEP, there's about 200 different recommendations, but it doesn't say where do we want our education system to be. It talks about flexibility, student choice, multiple entries, exits, everything, right? It does overview as well. It's not just about sort of me
so I think we
speaking.
must
I think even that
again, but I think there are more questions. I don't want to hijack my students' time,
No, given that we work in the education sector and increasingly we're starting to work in higher education, I think just being able to hear the student side of the story. And I think at the end of the day, much of my work is still sort of education which reaches lower income segment. So, those students are not necessarily always able to even articulate what they want. But I think, this group here, I think will very much be able to talk about what do you all believe higher education should look like? What do you enjoy and what do you miss?
As people in higher education, it's always a challenge for us also, and it's also or things like that. So many questions out there, so
Same.
Yeah, Tushar.
You have 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Where would you like to take this?
I just have so I'll join a couple of questions. Manya has asked, what would be your advice for a student who wishes to work towards a cause such as health education, etc. And Gauri has asked, what sorts of internship programs should we aim to enter the social development consulting sphere? So I guess they're correlated.
Sorry, repeat the second question again. What types of?
What sorts of internships or programs should we aim to enter the social development or consulting career?
Got it. Look, I think, there are just so many options today. The development sector is very varied, a little bit chaotic. There are options ranging from working with a grassroots organization, either an NGO or a social enterprise, a for-profit entity which is, working in education or health. There's many of them. There are a lot of research organizations in the development sector. There are a lot of monitoring and evaluation kind of organizations in the development sector, all of that, right? So I think there's varieties of options, and you could try any of them, depending upon what you feel like doing. So if you want to do more sort of research and thinking work, then you do research or M&E. If you want to do more grassroots, then you potentially do more of an NGO or a social enterprise kind of a role. And the thing is to try some things. I know a lot of people, for example, who go into working for TFI, and I know like TFI fellowships, and I know it pays very, very poorly, but I very rarely met anyone who's spent 2 years being a TFI fellow and sort of not come out of that and completely enriched. And there are many fellowships now. There are fellowships at Niti Aayog, there are fellowships in state governments. Delhi government has so many different fellowships of variety. So you can, I think there's the options for you are limitless, and like I said earlier, it doesn't matter where you start, right? And I think I genuinely say that I think all of your 20s are about learning, right? Try and learn as many things as you can, get as many different experiences as you can, stay with each experience for some reasonable time. Don't get bored after 4 months, but if you want to do something different every couple of years in your 20s, know why you're doing that. What are you trying to learn? What are you trying to experience? That's a good thing. And then by the time you're 30, you can sort of say, okay, now I've experienced a lot of different things. Where do I really want to build the next phase of my career? To me, I think that's a perfectly acceptable, in fact, legitimate way to build your career. So there's many different options. In order to join social impact consulting or consulting, look, like I said, I think consulting continues to be a little bit snobby in terms of where we recruit from and how we recruit, but that and I think our campus recruitments tend to be still from very few campuses, but if you look at how we recruit people laterally, and we're recruiting literally maybe 100 to 150 people, not from campuses, but from other, people who are working laterally every year, that comes from all sorts of places. In my own practice, I recruit people from, we have a program with Teach for India, because I genuinely value people who have studied in a good college and then have 2 years of actual classroom experience to be able to come and work in our education projects, because the kind of depth and knowledge they bring to our education projects is very different from an MBA who's probably only gone to private institutes their entire lives, right? And so they're so you may or may not, internships alone may or may not be the right way to find your way into social impact consulting. Depends. Some of the organizations that I mentioned on the last in my presentation, Samhita, Sattva, IP, etc. Actually, anyone who has high quality sort of internships in an NGO or in a grassroots level organization or in a foundation, probably will be will be well regarded over there. I think for BCG, if you want to join social impact consulting, I think 3-4 years of experience across, 1 or 2 organizations which do development sector work makes you, quite a compelling candidate for consulting.
If you could entertain one more question, shall I go ahead with it, ma'am?
One last question, sure.
So, ma'am, Mitali is asking about the work stability in consulting, and Tanmay is asking how do consultants at BCG adapt to the ever-changing situations in the industry and consulting sphere? If you could give a
Yeah, no, I think we talked a little bit about work stability. Look, I think if you're doing consulting, I think you have to enjoy breadth of experiences. You have to be someone who likes to push themselves into different situations, varying situations. You have to be someone who almost doesn't like predictability, right? And who doesn't like so I think you just have to be that kind of a person. And that's why from the very beginning, it's not that, consulting or any profession is the best profession in the world, right? It is suited to a certain type of people who enjoy doing a certain types of things. So consulting is a lot about change. It is a lot about ambiguity. It is a lot about doing different things over different months. It is unpredictable. I don't know what my next week is going to look like. My my EA in my office has access to my calendar. She can put whatever she wants, between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. on any given day, without checking with me. She decides what I do on a daily basis rather than I decide what I between those hours for the most part. And you have to like that. You have to enjoy that. And if you don't like that, and if you don't enjoy that, if you want much more control over your life, then there are many, many other amazing things to do, even within the development sector, foundations, working with a specific organization which does a very specific thing, extremely sort of rewarding, fulfilling careers.
Okay.
Yeah.
It has been a very fruitful and interactive session, and I would now like to request Kanika ma'am to propose a vote of thanks.
So, good evening, everyone. I would now like to thank our speaker, Ms Seema, for sharing her knowledge and experience. I'm sure students have thoroughly enjoyed the session and they have much to gain from your expertise. So, thank you so much for giving us an hour of a very candid conversation, and it's been a different experience to know your side of the story. And I think now the kids have more experience on how to go about consulting and what is the future prospects. So thank you, Seema. I would also like to thank our principal, sir. He couldn't make it today to the conversation because of prior commitments, but he sends his gratitude and we thank him for supporting us always. We'd also like to thank Dipali ma'am and the rest of the faculty members for joining us today. And obviously a big congratulations to the Student Council for making this event a success. So thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been a good evening.
Same here. No, thank you so much for having me, and genuinely would love to, maybe meet in person and have a two-way interaction at some point. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Kushagra, for hosting this.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right.
Before you leave, are we taking any group photographs? I think.
Yes, ma'am. We have taken
We've taken. Okay, Seema's also left. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. You can now leave the meeting.
Thank you.